everybody. Welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 20th of July. Last class, basically, I introduced you to the course by reviewing the syllabus and the course outline. I never had a chance to talk about the plagiarism section, though, so I just wanted to briefly touch on that. I'm sure you've probably heard of plagiarism in other English classes and in just other college classes as well, using somebody else's ideas or language without acknowledging the source. And it's comparable to theft, but basically it would be similar to taking somebody's intellectual property, let's say, rather than taking something like someone's possessions. And it's a fairly serious offense. If you get off easy, as I like to put it, you would fail the assignment, and if you didn't get off easy, you would be expelled from college with a notation on your transcript that you plagiarized. So it's something that you don't want to do. And I always give two stories to try to encourage you not to plagiarize. The first actually happened to me, and the second happened to someone that I read about, both around the same time period. So this would have been in the early 90s, so these were the early days of the internet. So neither one of us were able to do a electronic search on the internet, because as many sites as exist to help students plagiarize, there are an equal number of sites to help instructors determine if something has been plagiarized. One of my favorites is called Turnitin.com, where I can do an electronic search of a sentence or a section of a paragraph and look for it online. But again, none of this existed. I was reading a student paper and it occurred to me that it sounded familiar. And then I realized why it sounded familiar. I didn't have to think too hard about this. It was because it was from our own college textbook, and as if the student thought that I wouldn't recognize that passage. There were a few mechanical errors in there, whether it was because the student was a sloppy plagiarist or because the student deliberately wanted to try to convince me that this was their work by inserting some errors. I don't know. The better story that I have for you occurred around the same time period, and it was in all of the academic newspapers. There is such a thing as academic newspapers. And basically, it was a middle-aged professor. This part is important. He's reading papers, and he realizes that he's reading a paper that sounds somewhat familiar. Again, not that unusual for an instructor. And again, because this was the early 90s, he couldn't necessarily do an electronic search. So he had to think to himself, where have I seen this before? Where have I read this before? Because professors tend to be pretty well read. And as he continued to contemplate, he realized he hadn't read this before. He had written it himself 20 plus years earlier when he had been an undergraduate in college. It was one of his old papers. And it had something to do with a college fraternity that was basically recycling papers from fraternity brothers across the nation, and somehow, some way, this student ended up with his own professor's work that the professor had done as an undergraduate years earlier. So I would not want to be that student. So these are my two stories to encourage you not to plagiarize. As you know, your first speech, as I had indicated last class, is an autobiographical speech. So it's about your life. So I can't imagine that there would be any temptation or possibility of plagiarism, since it's about your own experiences. When we get to the informative and the persuasive speech, we'll talk about how to go about citing sources if you are using outside material so that you aren't plagiarizing, because that's the key. You just want to make sure that you are giving credit to the individual whose work you happen to be using, either their original ideas or their language. And then it's not plagiarism, it's research. But at any rate, what I wanted to do was to talk a little bit about some of the opening chapters in our textbook, and talk a little bit about your first speech, that autobiographical speech, which is going to be due on Tuesday, the 3rd of August, which means that we've got a little bit of time to talk about how to put together a speech before we actually deliver. Now, this is going to be a 5-minute speech in which you are going to tell the audience something about you or perhaps your life. You could perhaps decide to do a life overview. Obviously, you're going to have to do a good amount of condensing because you can't put years worth of material into a speech. Obviously, we don't have years to listen to your speech, so you would be condensing to approximately 5 minutes. Perhaps you might want to focus on something. Let's say a particular time period in your life or a hobby or person. And for students who have difficulty deciding what to discuss about themselves or feel a little shy about self-disclosure, what you might want to do is talk about education, whether it be your educational history or whether it be some of your educational goals in the future, or it could be why you are taking this particular class at this particular time at GCC, which is one thing that we all share. Now, I can tell you that this class is unusual, not just in the fact that it's being taught online, but it's also a very small class. There are only 4 students registered in this particular class. In fact, I'm not sure if I've ever taught a class that's quite this small. And there are advantages and disadvantages to having a small class, but since ultimately we are online, you've got an option of one of 2 ways to deliver your speech. You can either deliver live via Zoom. So if any of you are interested in delivering live via Zoom, you would be delivering the speech on the 3rd of August, which is a Tuesday. I ask you to contact me via my email, which is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu, to give me your times of availability on the 3rd of August, that Tuesday, and I'll try to find a common time. If you don't want to do your speech live via Zoom, you can always record your speech and upload it to our Moodle site. I will be adding a section in which you can add your first speech. And then what I'm going to do is to ask your classmates to view that speech and to send me feedback privately about strengths and weaknesses about that speech. And then I'll compile all of that together and make that available for everyone to view. Again, we've got a very small class, so 4 total at this particular point, unless somebody were to add, which is still a possibility. But regardless of the small size, I still think that we can have a good experience with talking about the delivery of speeches. And I'm well aware that this is the beginning of the semester, so you may still be adding, dropping, or looking for textbooks. So I was hopeful that you were able to read some opening chapters in the textbook, but I anticipate that perhaps you didn't have a chance to do such a thing. So if that's the case, this class would be equally beneficial to you, because I wanted to start with something that is not addressed in the textbook. It's something called Toastmasters, which you may or may not have heard of before. Basically, Toastmasters is an international organization that's devoted to helping its members develop public speaking skills. It's not affiliated with any kind of academic program, so it's not in any way evaluative. It was just a way for individuals to get together and basically find an audience. As I had talked about last class, the trick to practicing public speeches is ultimately finding a group of people who are willing to serve as your audience and to give you feedback. So that's what Toastmasters does. And they have a website, and you can see in the notes below this video I've included the website. And they came out with a video entitled Writing and Delivering Great Speeches. And I found that video on YouTube. What I want to do is to show you that, because it does a good amount of overview of what our textbook and our class will be doing. It's approximately a half hour or so. So what I would ask you to do is to watch that video now. You can see that in the notes below I've got the web link for that. And then you can return back to this video. So at about 9 minutes and 6 seconds. 9 minutes and 6 seconds, we are back. So I hope that you have had the opportunity to watch the Toastmasters video. And what I wanted to do is just review some of the pieces of the video that I think are particularly important. They talked about the 3 major kinds of speeches: the informative speech, the persuasive speech and the entertainment speech. And that the informative speech in particular needs to be clear and concise because you're trying to teach your audience something. And in fact, you will be giving your informative speech as your second speech this semester. The persuasive speech, where you're trying to convince someone to take some sort of action or perhaps to support some sort of belief or a combination of the two. And you need to motivate an individual to want to take action or to engage in support. And usually the way you motivate is by appealing to their emotions. And that is our third speech this semester, our last speech. The entertaining speech, we don't necessarily have a speech devoted to entertainment, but we do have the autobiographical speech, which I personally find to be quite entertaining. I enjoy very much hearing about my students and their life experiences. And in fact, you might also feel the same way when you hear about your classmates. In fact, you might learn more about your classmates in this particular class than you might in many other classes where it's quite possible to be seated next to somebody and not even have a conversation with them. So at least in this particular scenario, you'll be able to learn a little bit about who is in the class, which I try to do with our first discussion forum by asking you to introduce yourself to your classmates, but obviously you would be doing this much more in depth because it's a 5-minute speech. And for that particular speech, the Toastmasters video talks about the importance to do storytelling and utilize some humor when appropriate in order to keep your audience's interest. But I would say that these divisions, and even the divisions that I have in our class, are rather superficial, in that all speeches, hopefully, if they're well done, have an element of entertainment and autobiography to them, that you are probably referencing yourself and trying to use some stories or humor when appropriate. That all speeches are informative. They're all trying to teach us something. Even your autobiographical speech is trying to teach us about you. And the persuasive speech is going to need to give us information to try to persuade us. And the persuasive speech, I think that uses information, that uses entertainment. And all speeches have a persuasive element to them because you're basically trying to convince us that whatever you're talking about has some importance. So I think they all kind of blend into one, but I've divided them up, as that video did as well, into separate entities so we could work on specific skills. The video talked about the importance of practicing. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of practicing. The more you practice, the more comfortable you're going to be with the material that you are giving so that you can focus on your presentation. And in fact, I even have practice sessions scheduled throughout the semester for us to practice our speeches, whether you elect to do that via Zoom with me, or you want to do that via telephone, or even through email or chat. But in one way or another, I'd like you to have some time with me where we could talk about your speech. Now, the preparation of a speech is particularly important. That's the piece that you don't get to see your audience, or you don't get to see the speaker engage in. All the audience sees is the finished product. But there was a lot of work and preparation that went into it. And some of the things you need to consider are the logistics. In other words, what time is the speech going to be, how long the speech should be, things of that nature, where you are going to be delivering your speech, the location, who your audience is going to be. And again, the audience will be members of this particular class and myself, which gives you a good amount of information already before you've even begun to put together your speech. The objective of your speech, the reason why you are delivering your speech, and any research that you might need to incorporate into your speech and how you would go about that. And then finally, writing some sort of an outline for your speech. And oftentimes students say that they feel more comfortable with writing a paper than they might with delivering a speech. And if that's the case, I oftentimes suggest that you begin with writing out a paper, much like you would do for your autobiography. And then what you can do is to translate that into a speech by identifying keywords and phrases and putting that into a speaking outline, which is what we are going to be talking about. And in fact, I have some people in my writing class who say they feel much more comfortable speaking than writing. And what I usually suggest to them is that they record themselves actually speaking a paper, and then they transcribe that, so that ultimately what they've got is an outline, a writing outline that they can follow to construct the paper. So it can go either way. Now, the introduction of your speech is very similar to the introduction of a paper. This is where you're going to give your thesis, your main point, and this is also where you want to greet your audience. And a lot of times that doesn't happen because of nerves, that a speaker is so anxious that they just go immediately into the topic. But do take some time to say hello to your audience. It settles the audience and lets them know that it's time to time to pay attention, and it also gives you a moment to collect yourself. And then there's the discussion section, which is oftentimes called the body in English classes. That this is where you give your evidence, and this is where you give your details. And then finally, there is a conclusion, and this is where you give closure, and this is where you say farewell to your audience. And again, oftentimes that doesn't happen in a speech because the speaker is so nervous that they just stop without cueing the audience that the speech is over, so we're not quite sure. So it can be something as simple as saying thank you for your time, or if you have any questions, let me know, but that's enough of a cue to know that the speaker is done speaking. And then there's the actual presentation piece, which is very theatrical, where you have to think about things like eye contact and body language and vocal inflections and pausing. And you want to try to be conversational. You don't want to be as formal as you would be in an academic paper. It would be as if you were having a conversation with somebody, but a conversation that you've done some preparation work beforehand for. If you think about how you might prepare for an important conversation, let's say in the workplace or with a significant other, you might review in your mind some of the major points that you would want to address. And that said, things might change over the course of the conversation with your employer or your significant other based on their responses, but at least you've got some sort of a game plan ahead of time. And you've tried to anticipate questions and responses so that you can address them appropriately. Now, the 3 chapters that I had assigned from our textbook, Chapter 1, Speech in Higher Ed, Chapter 2, Getting Started, and finally Chapter 3, Critical Listening, are 3 chapters to help us begin the process of planning a speech. And the first chapter, Speech in Higher Education, talks about some of the reasons why it's important to study public speaking. And you can see that what we've got are the introduction of terms. Some of those terms would be terms that are associated with the discipline of rhetoric and communication, which is one of the things that you want to familiarize yourself when you're taking an introductory class. And these are also possibilities for quiz questions. If you will remember, I had indicated last class that there will be 4 quizzes announced in advance over the course of the semester, and they're open book, open notes, and they address the textbook readings and my class videos. And what they are is basically a review of some of the important elements that we've discussed, and also important elements for you to keep in mind when you're delivering a speech, because ultimately what's most important is the actual speech delivery. But something like a term like intellectual imperative, which was a term that was introduced in the textbook, and luckily they oftentimes bold those terms so that we can know that they are important, is one of the reasons why we study public speaking, why it's a requirement in many degree programs such as GCC. That, in other words, to be an educated individual, you want to have a background in lots of different disciplines. And mathematics and literature and science and history and public speaking, communication, rhetoric. So, and if you know anything about literature, literature began through the oral tradition with the recitation of some of the great epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, for instance, done orally. Luckily for us, they were written down so that we have a historical record of them and we can study them today. So just as a well-educated person is something that you should have some experience with. And they call that the intellectual imperative. However, there also is the social imperative. And what that means is that as a social being, as a human being, you are going to be interacting with others. In other words, the communication process, whether it be one-on-one or one-on-many, is something that's going to be occurring over a lifetime. So outside of any kind of academic requirements, these skills are skills that you can use in your daily life, whether they be in the workplace, if you're giving a presentation, or perhaps trying to convince an employer or employers, a group of individuals, to hire you for a job. It could be a social function, something like a party where you give a toast or a wedding. So the social imperative is something that goes way beyond the academic or the intellectual imperative. And then lastly, there's the consumer imperative, which I've become much more interested in as time has gone on. That basically we are audience members and we consume the communication, the speeches of others. And this is a challenging class, I think, to teach, because while we have textbooks and we certainly have criteria on how to deliver a speech, we are surrounded in the everyday world with speeches that don't follow those criteria, oftentimes in the political realm. And the speaker is rewarded with power, with money, with position. And if they were to do the same thing in a classroom, that individual would likely fail. And the result is that, well, we, I think, as audience members, should demand better of our public figures. That if we have this level of expectation for ourselves and our peers, we should have that as well for people in authority. And we should hold them accountable when they don't hold to that particular criteria. So the consumer imperative, again, is one of the reasons why you want to study public speaking, is so that you can be an educated consumer of speeches and, again, evaluate them from an academic perspective. Now, public speaking is a rather circular process. We oftentimes think about it as a speaker delivering a message to an audience and then we're done. It's not quite that simple. There is a speaker who gives a message to an audience, but then the audience responds to that message. And the audience gives feedback, whether it be obvious feedback, such as raising a hand or laughing or yawning, or perhaps less obvious feedback. But nevertheless, there is some kind of feedback given by the audience, and an astute public speaker is reading that feedback and trying to make minor adjustments throughout the course of the speech. Now, you can't completely change a speech, but certainly you can get an impression if something is working, let's say. If you tell a joke and the audience seems to be very engaged, perhaps you should continue on along that vein. If you tell a joke and the audience doesn't laugh, perhaps it's best to just stop there and to move forward with something else. So if you think about it, the audience is giving feedback, and then a good speaker is trying to adjust to that particular feedback, within reason, of course. And one major term that is discussed in the first chapter, and is something that we will be reviewing over and over again over the course of the semester, is ethos, which is Greek for a word that you are probably familiar with, ethics. You can see that ethos looks very much like ethics, and it's about credibility and making sure that you are a credible speaker, which again goes back to what I was indicating about the consumer imperative and how many times we as the recipients of speeches are given communications that aren't clear, that are not well organized, that are not well researched, and that aren't ethical. And again, I say that as audience members, we should hold those individuals accountable. And certainly we want to hold ourselves to a higher standard than that. So I would say those are the major points in Chapter 1. You might have noticed also that at the ending of the chapters, there is a summary of the major points in the chapter. So that could be useful for your review as well. Chapter 2 is about getting started, which is exactly what you are doing now. You are getting started, trying to put together your first speech, your 5-minute autobiographical speech. Although in the back of your mind, you might be thinking about your informative and even your persuasive speech. And I have had students that have used the autobiographical speech as a kind of springboard to move to the informative and then ultimately the persuasive. So in your autobiographical speech, you might want to talk about that you are a basketball player. And then in your informative speech, you might want to give us the history of basketball. And then in your persuasive speech, you might want to try to convince us that GCC should start a basketball program. That said, there isn't any reason why the three speeches have to connect and link. They can all be on very separate topics as well. So it just depends on your preference. But as you know, this is a summer class, and summer classes are condensed. So even though you're thinking about the first speech, as well you should, keeping the second and the third in the back of your mind and some possibilities of how you could proceed would be very useful. So basically, you're getting started, and if you are looking at the second chapter, you'll see that there's a visual there that looks like a staircase, which I think is a nice way of thinking of it. And we are at the bottom of the staircase at the first stair. Basically, we're selecting and narrowing the topic. And I've given you a very broad idea for your first speech. The topic is autobiographical, you. But then you have to figure out what exactly are you going to talk about for yourself, and how are you going to fit that into the criteria. Approximately 5 minutes. And again, it doesn't have to be down to the second, but what you want to do is to try to get it close to the 5 minutes. The longer the speech, the more leeway you have. So usually what I tell students is for a 5-minute speech, something like between 4.5 minutes and 5.5 minutes would be about right. So you could go a little bit under, you could go a little bit over. Now, if you were giving an hour speech, and don't panic, you're not, but if you were giving an hour speech, well then you could go 5 minutes under or 5 minutes over. But if you are giving a 5-minute speech, you certainly don't want to go under 5 minutes. That means you would have no speech. And you certainly don't want to go over 5 minutes. That would mean that you have a 10-minute speech. It's twice as long as it needs to be. So basically, the longer the speech, the more wiggle room you have. So, and that's part of the practicing, is getting the timing right. But you want to be in the ballpark of about 5 minutes. And then you want to determine the purpose of the speech. And you might decide, well, that's obvious. The purpose of the speech is so that I could satisfy the requirements that the instructor has, so I can earn a good grade in the class. That is true, but there are other objectives. My objective is not only that we get to learn a little bit more about each other in this class through the autobiographical speech, but also that you get to practice the techniques and methods that I'm discussing, the Toastmasters video discussed, and the textbook is discussing as well. And you might have very different purposes as well for delivering the speech. You might want to try to impress one of your classmates for a particular reason. Perhaps you're hoping for a date, and that would be a very specific reason or purpose for you. But my purpose, the general purpose, is for you to practice your public speaking skills and for also you to get to know each other a little bit better. Analyzing the audience and the occasion. Again, I had indicated that we are going to be audience members, so you already have some information about things like level of maturity. We assume we're working with a group of adults. Educational background, college level. And the occasion is basically an academic situation. I'm fond of saying you can't make this stuff up, and that sometimes the school of real life is much better than anything you can learn from a textbook. So I want to share a story with you about how someone did not analyze audience and occasion very well. It did not occur to me. It occurred to one of my colleagues at another institution. I'm not going to say which, but it was another community college in Massachusetts. And basically, this student was giving a speech about the importance of being true to oneself. So it was a very philosophical speech. And throughout the speech, the student began removing articles of clothing. So it began with basically removing a watch, and then a hat, and then a shirt, shoes, socks, and then eventually they began unbuttoning a belt. And the instructor stopped it right there and wanted to know exactly what exactly was happening here. And the students said that they were basically wanting to show their true selves to the class, because this was a class about, or this was a speech about being true to oneself. Needless to say, the instructor was not impressed and stopped the speech right then and there. And I always use this as an example of somebody who did not analyze the audience or the occasion. The student had intended to strip, and that would not be suitable or appropriate for an academic setting. So if you learn nothing else this semester, remember not to strip during a speech. So that's my little story about not analyzing audience and occasion. Gathering material. Again, for the first speech, my suspicion is you already know the information that you're going to share, but this could be an opportunity for you to talk with family members or even do a little bit of genealogical research if you so wanted to. When we get to the second and the third speech, we will definitely talk more about gathering information and how to let your audience know when you are using information that is not yours. In other words, citing that information. Making a speaking outline. Now this is going to be important, and if you are familiar with outlines for writing papers, then you're probably familiar with the idea that the more detailed your outline is, then the easier it is for you to write the paper because you've already done a lot of the work. It's not the same with public speaking, because if you have an outline that's too detailed, you're going to need to read that outline, which means you're going to sacrifice things like eye contact and body language with your audience. So less is more with the speaking outline. Just key words and phrases just to remind you of the major points that you want to discuss. And then you fill that in with non-scripted material. And there actually is an entire chapter in the textbook that will talk a little bit about outlining, and we'll talk about it as well as we continue. Practicing out loud. Again, the more practice you can get and the more situations you can get, the more comfortable you will be with your delivery. And then finally, the actual delivery of the speech. So in terms of this visual, we're sort of at the beginning of the staircase where we are selecting and narrowing the topic, determining the purpose, and analyzing audience and occasion. And then over the next several classes, you'll be gathering material if necessary, making a speaking outline, practicing, and then finally delivering. And I would say that those are the major pieces of the second chapter. The third chapter is entitled Critical Listening. The idea that you're being an audience member and listening and consuming the speeches of others is just as important, and that you want to do it in a critical way, in an analytic way. Critical thinking isn't necessarily about criticism and talking about the negatives of something, but it's about basically analyzing and interpreting and asking questions. And there is a difference between hearing, which is just merely processing sound, and listening, when you are actually paying attention. Most individuals can hear, unless they happen to be deaf. But oftentimes people hear, but they don't necessarily listen. They're not paying attention. And there are actually very good reasons why individuals don't pay attention. And this is another place where we are introduced to terms you may not be familiar with, but you're probably familiar with the general concept. Daydreaming. One of the reasons why we don't pay attention when we are hearing something is because we might be daydreaming. Or the way that we refer to it in this discipline is the internal perceptual field. In other words, that internally, you are not focused on what's happening. And one of the reasons why is because you can think much more quickly than someone can speak. So eventually your thoughts will drift, and if you've ever experienced daydreaming, and I'm sure you have, one thought leads to another thought, leads to another thought, and before you know it, you've lost a piece of what was being said. Or if you've ever driven and you've gotten to your destination and you can't quite remember how you got to that destination, you might have a somewhat similar experience. There are reasons why in the educational setting we encourage students to take notes, because when they are listening to something, hearing it and also listening, that means that they're able to write it out as notes. So taking notes is one of the ways that you can keep an audience member listening and hopefully not daydreaming too much. There's also something called the external perceptual field. If internal is inside of the mind, external is outside of the mind. And this is the environment. Elements in the environment that can distract you. Things like temperature, lighting, noise. And again, it's very human and very common to be distracted by any of these. Sometimes as a public speaker, you can manipulate some of these. and you can adjust things like temperature or noise or lighting for your audience. And sometimes you can't. But the idea is that you have to be aware of that. If we're going to be audience centered, thinking about the needs of the audience, which is what you should be doing, rather than expecting the audience to adapt to you, you want to try to make sure that you are presenting in such a way so that there's less likelihood that there will be distractions, either internally through daydreaming or externally in the environment. Now, you can ask yourself a good number of questions when you are listening to a speech, and in fact, some of those are addressed in our textbook, and I'll talk about those. And even in the syllabus and other documents folder above in our Moodle site, I have some as well that actually are going to form the template for how I will be evaluating the first speech, where it is divided into introduction, body, conclusion, and then the actual presentation. And those are all of the elements that we will be discussing over the course of the semester. So I'll use that template to evaluate your speech and write a few notes and give you a letter grade, and then return that to you. For the second and the third speech, I don't even bother with the template. I just take notes and talk about strengths and weaknesses as they occur to me. But that template is a good guideline for you in terms of how to put together your own speech, because this is how you're going to be evaluated, and also how to receive the speeches of your classmates and just all speeches in general, even from public figures. So this is where we're going to pick up next class and talk a little bit about those questions when listening. And I also wanted to talk about 3 more chapters. Chapter 7, organizing and outlining speeches. Chapter 8, beginning and ending speeches. And lastly, Chapter 9, wording speeches. So for today's attendance question, that'll be due on our discussion forum by Wednesday, the 21st at 9 a.m. So you have 24 hours in which to respond to this. There was one element about the Toastmasters video that I did not discuss, and that was about nervousness. And it's a commonality that just about all public speakers have. So I thought we may as well just address this right now. And my question to you is, what suggestions do you have to control nervousness? My suspicion is that you've been in situations before where you felt nervous, whether it's delivering a speech or taking an examination or something else that's led to a bit of anxiety. You may have your own techniques. The textbook also talks about techniques that are efficient and effective. So we'll talk about this next class as well, about ways to control nervousness. But this will be your attendance question. And as I indicated, for the attendance question, you don't have to respond to the responses of your classmates, but do read your classmates' responses, because this will give you an idea of what you would have heard in a class discussion. And do note that I will respond to all of your responses, so you can read those as well. So that basically does it for today. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class and talk about some of the specific elements of delivering a speech. Take care. Bye-bye.